Okay, I'm very excited to bring you guys this information. I doubt many of you know who this is and know about his connection to the most magical substance in the universe. He was a scientist, but what he says is going to blow your mind and I think change your life forever. And I also think that he made some prophetic predictions about the future, and this man is going to go down in history for being one of the first people documented to talk about this thing that I'm about to talk about. But for reasons which I'm about to say, his work was basically buried, and I'm going to bring it back. Okay, so this man's name is Frank Washington Very. He lived from 1852 to 1927. He was part of a wave of people who discovered what they thought to be luminiferous ether, which was disproved by what was called the Michelson-Morley experiment in the early 1900s. The thing is, that experiment was wrong. This video was not about that, but basically, to get into it, they tested what they thought to be a stationary luminiferous ether and found that it didn't exist. The thing is, the luminiferous ether, what I call plasma, the fourth state of matter, which no one seemed to make the connection with, is not stationary. It is moving. And all these people, by the way, talked about how it was moving, but somehow the tested it based on it being stationary, because a lot of these people, based out of fear, believed in the universe as being mechanistic, not spiritual, which makes sense. This is not about hating on scientists or people. But this brave frickin' man, who was an astronomer, an astrophysicist, and a meteorologist that studied at MIT, who taught physics, he said the things I'm about to say. I literally think this guy is just as smart as Nikola Tesla, Albert Einstein, anyone else, but somehow no one knows who he is. First things first, just to legitimize him and show you how this guy was basically buried, he worked with Langley, the guy that basically had to do with the invention of airplanes. He had just as much to do, this is in his obituary in NASA, by the way, he had just as much to do with the development of the heavier than air flying machine, the airplane, as Langley. They studied together, they did experiments together. Frank Washington Very knew every type of bird that flew. Hummingbirds, he even studied beetles. 50 different species of hummingbirds alone. And this research went into the creation of the heavier than air flying machine. He was also described as being very philosophical in temperament. He was very positive and outright in his opinions, and he made sparks fly in the heat of argument, very much like me. Obviously, scientists, especially mechanistic ones, which are most of them, disagreed with him. But God, I know he was right. I know it in my heart, and I know what I'm about to read to you guys, you will feel this too. Those of you who are connected with your heart and soul and plasma. But they also said about him, and I just want to preface with this, no matter how bitter the argument, it was never personal with him. He was delightful. He had a sense of justice and fairness. He didn't take it personal that these people didn't believe him. And neither do I, by the way. Like, if people don't believe me, whatever. And he was an antagonist to be feared, yet ever lovable. He didn't look into the abyss of space and see only gloom and nothingness, but rather he saw he was one who looked upon the stars as the handiwork of the creator of plasma and consciousness. Okay, finally we can get into what he said and how it relates to plasma and all of us being plugged into this power and being magicians. This is going to happen in our lifetime. So the first thing, he wrote What Becomes of the Light of the Stars. It was an article in Popular Science in 1913. He basically explained, after the Michelson-Morley experiment already disproved ether, he explained why there still needed to be an ether. And by the way, even Einstein said that there still needed to be an ether in the 1920s. You can look it up, fact check me. But for some reason, which once again, I'm writing more about my book because I can't explain it all here, the knowledge of a luminous ether got turned into like the quantum field and quantum physics instead of quintessence and plasma studies, which literally was buried. This happened in the late 1800s to early 1900s. You can look up all of this. I'm compiling this all in the first chapters of my book. You can sign up on my Stan store for a free email notification when my book comes out, which will be all about plasma and plasma intelligence. And science is only giving me a couple chapters. It's more about like the mysticality of it and how you can improve yourself in your life. But I have to start with the hidden history. So anyway, basically after the Michelson-Morley experiment disproved ether, it went underground for like 10, 20 years. And then all of a sudden plasma came up. But no one said they were alike. But Frank Washington Very, he might have died around the time when they just started to talk about plasma, or maybe it was a little after. But he spoke about why there's a luminiferous ether, why it's alive and moving, and why it's spiritual. Let's get into it. So in What Becomes of the Light of the Stars, in the conclusion, he says, the conception of a universal ether is to many so vague that the distinction between ether and a purely spiritual atmosphere seems slight. And when I say ether, basically just think of plasma, the fourth state of matter, which is an ionized gas, but it's basically everywhere. It makes up everything. Think of the not religion, but think of animism. It animates everything. It is part of nature. It's inside of me. It's outside of me. My consciousness molds it. Okay. The mind of man is not conditioned by space, though cannot be measured by the yardstick. Ether, on the contrary, occupies space. The dimensions of its waves, really quick, I think when he's saying right here, thought cannot be measured, but ether occupies space, I think in a way he's kind of channeling that plasma is not consciousness. Like there's consciousness and your thought, and there's like an ego thought, but there's a consciousness thought once you're connected to your soul, which is plasma. And then there's plasma or sentience, which our consciousness can mold. And they work together, but they're not the same thing. They actually are the same thing at a higher level, but we'll get into that later. The dimensions of its waves have been made the fundamental standards of our units of length. Nevertheless, we still grope and guess as to the real structure and nature of ether, because no one knew what it was. Some of its properties seem to verge on the metaphysical. Thank you. Back of it, we have glimpses of a source of energy which is inexhaustible, as if it were most intimately linked with the infinite source of all existence. This guy wrote this in 1913. Matter, and he was a scientist, matter which used to be looked upon as dead and as incapable of exhibiting energy except as this was thrust upon it from without by physical forces, begins to look almost alive. It moves, said Galileo of the solid earth. Plasma is sentient, plasma is intelligent, plasma is alive. One of the only books out there right now about this is called A New Science of Heaven by Robert Temple. I highly recommend it until my book comes out. But his is more science-based. I'm not trying to invent something new or say I'm a scientist, even though I feel like I think like one a little. I'm not going to try to technically prove anything in science. I'm just going to shed light on a few things and then talk about the metaphysics of plasma, which it's hard to prove. But once again, you just know in your heart if something's true, and you can take it or leave it. Anyway, he finishes with, creation is not the bringing forth of an infinite number of dead structureless particles sent out as a set of miserable little waifs at some indefinitely remote epoch and left to clash without guidance, without purpose. Creation is perpetual. It's always changing. Plasma, always changing. Complexity. The interiors of matter are seen to be more and more wonderful, more and more intensely active. It evolves. And as we approach the sacred portals where divine influx from the soul of the universe quickens into energy, which is matter. He is basically explaining how plasma creates hardened matter and how it's the soul of the universe, or intelligent or sentient, and that it's ever evolving. Our purpose here on Earth is to experience and evolve, and plasma working in tandem with consciousness make this possible. This is life. And this guy channeled and knew this. Okay, he also wrote a book called The Luminiferous Ether, its relation to the electron and to a universal interstellar medium and its relation to the atom. This is the most profound book ever. I cannot talk about it all now, but I will talk about this in future videos, how plasma has to do with the electron. He called the interstellar medium, which they disproved as ether, an aura. I call it plasma. Same thing. So if you read it, just think that. He also read this guy, Emanuel Swedenborg's work. And this just shows you how he cared about truth and how pure this man was. He basically wrote a commentary on Principia by Swedenborg, saying that truth is his single aim. And there were some things that he disproved that Swedenborg said, but that Swedenborg was right about a lot of things. He basically talked about ether too. He talks about criticizing the teachings, but he is assured by his noble wards that he would not ask him to do otherwise because he is after truth. So proving someone wrong, but when you're after truth, is okay. And basically that he thought more people would build on his theories, which I'm literally doing. He is one of many people who have inspired me, including Nikola Tesla, Aristotle, so many people I can't talk about it now. I'm running out of time. Anyway, this man's a genius. Plasma is magic. This is one of many people who talked about it. If you like this, you'll love my book. Happy hunting.